Thank you so much for joining us for another dispatch from the Frontlines. This is an ongoing series from the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, where we hear from people whose lives have been upended by this pandemic and discuss the policy decisions being made, or in some cases delayed in Washington, that are affecting all of our lives. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'm Alan Barber, the Policy Director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. We're a nonprofit organization that works to inform the public about policies that promote justice, equity, and fairness. It's crystal clear that the coronavirus pandemic and the choices of the Trump administration have created an economic crisis for working families. Millions of households are on the brink of disaster every month as they struggle to decide whether to put food on the table or try to make rent. The federal response to the housing crisis has been grossly inadequate. Well, it was grossly inadequate before COVID-19, and those failings have only been magnified by the crisis, with millions of families hanging over the edge of an eviction cliff. Now, while the CARES Act helped curb evictions in some parts of the country during the crisis, temporary moratoriums and empty executive orders have fallen short as countless families were unable to keep their homes, particularly in communities where residents were most at risk from COVID-19 related complications. And coming up in January, when the latest moratoriums expire, we could face a tsunami of evictions all around the country. But it doesn't have to be that way. Tenants have been rising up all over the country for years, from the Bay Area to Kansas City to Baltimore, Maryland, demanding equitable, safe, and sustainable housing solutions that make sure everyone's basic needs are met. We can build a more just economy in the wake of this crisis by canceling rent now and building millions of affordable homes for the future. Tonight, we're lucky to be joined by an incredible group of special guests who are going to help us understand where we're at in this crisis and just as importantly, paint a vision for what's possible when our policy solutions meet the scale of the crisis that we're facing. So please join me in welcoming Tiana Caldwell. Tiana is a co-founder of TC Tenants and a leader on the People's Action Home Guarantee team. Linda June is the Senior Policy Counsel at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. And Sean Frimstad is the Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We also want to give a big shout out to the Homes Guarantee team at People's Action, who helped bring this conversation together and who've been visionary grassroots leaders for housing justice for years. We're going to start off with a conversation with Tiana. Tiana, we know that there was a housing crisis in the country long before COVID-19. But for those who don't know, can you tell us a bit about your own struggle to find safe and affordable housing?
My name is Tiana Caldwell, and I am a leader with KC Tenants, as Alan introduced. Thank you. My family and I were evicted from our home after I received my second diagnosis and was actively in treatment for ovarian cancer. Like so many other people, I was forced to choose between paying rent, paying to protect my health, or paying to stay in my home. Those are my choices. I chose to live, and we were evicted. We were then scammed by the only property owner that would give us a chance after that eviction, and we ultimately spent 6 months homeless, paying $300 to $500 a week to live in hotels. Right now, we are housed, but I was laid off in March, and I have struggled to pay rent ever since. We were recently brought to eviction court once again. Ultimately, the case was dismissed, but the violence of evictions is still very much live for me and my family. There are far too many stories like mine, far too many people, families who are just one emergency away from being homeless. And for me, like for many, my struggle began long before I was even born. We can't talk about my family's current crisis without acknowledging that we are descendants of slaves whose labor was exploited for property owners' profit. My grandparents fought for the US in wars overseas, and did not benefit from the GI Bill that secured white wealth in this country forever. My struggle is the product of the horrors caused by centuries of racial capitalism.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I'm so glad to hear that you and your family were able to find some secure housing. But I know the struggle still goes on. And thank you for grounding part of this conversation in the fact that those who are facing housing insecurity now, part of it is due to the legacy of slavery and discrimination in this country. And until we begin to address some of those underlying issues, we're going to have a hard time arriving at truly equitable solutions to the problems that we're facing right now acutely during this COVID crisis. So I'm hoping that maybe you can talk about how you were able to relate your experience to other people's experience, because like you said, there are many people out there who are still struggling. How were you able to relate your struggle to theirs so that you could come together and organize tenants' rights associations?
As I said, there are many people who are just one emergency away, right? And that covers most of us, right? So making the connection on those levels, we may not have the same problems that are going on, but we have a mutual interest, and we make those connections so that we can build the strength in numbers that we need to make change. So it may not all be about the same struggle, but you connect on struggle and mutual interest, and there are many people who are dealing with housing injustice. And once you start sharing your story, they start to share as well. And you find out that you're definitely not alone by far.
What are some of the challenges that you faced and you and your comrades have faced as you began to organize and advocate for tenants' rights?
You face the narrative of the opposition a lot. There are a lot of untruths, a lot of things that are put out there to shift how people feel. They like to say that people are lazy, or they just don't want to work, or they're not trying to do anything else or be productive. People in the streets, things like that. Those narratives are dangerous because there are people dying in the streets and who are trying just to live every day. So it's been a real struggle trying to show people what's really going on. That's why those stories and those real experiences are so important.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I want to turn specifically to the work that you do with People's Action and other organizations around organizing a homes guarantee. Can you tell us why that is such an important piece of policy and what it would mean for families like yours?
Absolutely. We live in the richest country in the world. So why do millions of people experience homelessness? Why do 12 million people spend half their paychecks on the rent? One emergency, as I said, a flat tire or a sick kid is all that separates people like me from eviction or homelessness. People are forced to choose between putting food on the table or paying rent. How is that even possible in a country of so many riches? Right now, it's almost impossible to imagine a different way. To imagine that we wouldn't have to stress about paying rent every month. But there's another way, and we have imagined it. It's a homes guarantee. A group of grassroots leaders have knocked doors, organized our neighbors, and developed our vision for housing justice. Because we who have suffered from housing injustice are best equipped to imagine a different world and to build the power to win it. When it comes to housing policy, incrementalism is dead. We need bold action now. A homes guarantee would mean I wouldn't have to sacrifice vital medication to pay my rent. It would mean peace of mind because we wouldn't have the violent threat of homelessness stifling every opportunity and decision we have to make for our families. For families like mine, a homes guarantee would mean we could live with dignity. We could dream of a bright future. We could provide for our son. It would literally be the difference between life and death. Thank you.
Thank you again. What you're asking for isn't anything extraordinary. It's something that we should be, that all of us should be accorded and afforded as a basic human right. And I'm so glad to hear that you coming together with the folks of People's Action and other tenants organizations to push for the homes guarantee. We have a couple of extra minutes left with you. Maybe could you talk a little bit about how the homes guarantee is translating into specific policy proposals, or is that something that you're familiar with?
Well, I know that they've been pushing forward and there have been some opposition to it. We've been on calls to push policy. Unfortunately, it is definitely not where it should be or even in a position of where we would want it to be. We're still trying to build that power to make sure that we can win. But we are building those numbers. Nothing happens overnight when you're organizing. You have to stay the course. And the thing about it is that you have to trust the process, and we are trusting the process. We know that housing is a human right. We know that everyone deserves shelter. We will keep fighting as long as it takes, but we are making strides. We are getting the narrative out. We're seeing more of our language in more places, and we just got to stay the course. We won't give up.
So 2 more questions for you, and I think we'll go on to another panelist. I don't want to hold you too long. So could you tell us a little bit about the experience of TC Tenants, how it was formed, and what's happening right now in Kansas City?
Yes. Eviction is a huge problem right now in Kansas City. We do know that the CDC eviction moratorium is supposed to be in place, but implementation is not going well in cities like mine. Our presiding judge is allowing evictions to continue and actually laying out a playbook for landlords to continue to evict their tenants in other ways. So we are doing tenant defense, eviction defense in courtrooms. We've done direct actions where we have actually stopped evictions for one day. I think that they only got to do like 7 that day, and there have been hundreds in our courts. So we are standing by our tenants. We are providing resources and connecting them with a program that is connected to us, that is helping them to get representation. We are doing everything that we can in our power to help tenants stay in their home, right? When this all started, that was the remedy, right? When a vaccine to treat the pandemic was not, when there wasn't one, they said housing was the vaccine, housing was the prescription. We were told to stay at home, right? To keep ourselves and our communities healthy. And now we find that legislators have failed to make that possible for a vast majority of tenants like me. Rents and mortgages could have been canceled. They haven't been. Congress could have passed a big relief package to include a full eviction moratorium for the duration of the crisis. Congress hasn't done that. We've already talked about the CDC eviction moratorium, where implementation is not going well in many cities. Meanwhile, people across the country, like me, are facing inconceivable debts, and the debts just keep coming. We are being financially ruined now. Generally speaking, the economy will recover. Things will return to normal for some, but others of us will be left behind. My family might be left behind. I might be sacrificed along the way.
I think I'm not alone in hoping and praying that that's not the case. I think we all want to, I think at least the folks who are tuning in here and the people on this panel don't want to go back to what was normal. We want to go beyond that. We want to create something that's more, that's based on justice, it's based on equity, that recognizes the inherent rights of all of us, so that people don't have to go through and experience the struggles like those that you've experienced through this process. And I want to turn really quickly to one point that you made when you mentioned that housing was supposed to be the cure. And you're absolutely right. That was supposed to be the vaccine. We had focused on making sure that people that were able to stay at home, for making sure that people who had jobs were able to stay at home and still get a paycheck and be connected to their jobs, or people who didn't have a job had really strong unemployment benefit protections or other protections that would make it possible for them to continue to buy food and pay their utility bills. We should have gone further in canceling utility payments. And we're seeing some of that in the new package that the House introduced late last night, and some of your fellow panelists will discuss that later. But I really want to thank you for zeroing in on the fact that housing was supposed to be the vaccine. And I really want to thank you for sharing your story. It can't be easy to go through that. It can't be easy to deal with, everything that was happening with you personally in terms of your health, and then worrying about your family, and then to come here and share that story with us, and to keep fighting and helping to organize others to push for what we all deserve. I just want to applaud you really quickly for that, because that's really amazing work that you did that.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Now we're going to turn to Linda June from Americans for Financial Reform. Our next speaker, Linda, is the Senior Policy Counsel at Americans for Financial Reform. She serves as the policy lead for consumer and housing issues, including mortgages, lending discrimination, language access, small dollar loans, debt collection, credit reporting, fintech, small business, and other consumer financial protection concerns. What other concerns are there, Linda? That's a big portfolio. So I want to kind of build off of a point that was just brought up by Tiana, and I want to ask you a little bit about how this crisis has affected Black, Brown, and Indigenous people and other people of color. What are some of the ways that the federal government can address the historic and present failure to address the housing needs of these communities of color during this crisis and beyond?
Thank you so much for having me and for organizing this. And I really thank Tiana for setting the stage for our conversation. I think it's so appropriate that she was our first speaker on this panel to really put this stuff into context. And building off of what she was saying, I mean, so much of the financial system, and as you mentioned, I cover a very large portfolio. AFR is a coalition, and so I work with many partners on many of those issues. But I will say what ties them all together, and especially in the housing space, is really like systemic racism has been built into, unfortunately, a lot of the workings of the financial system, which kind of covers all of the areas that I cover in my portfolio. And I think of just, as Tiana was reflecting on our history as a country, and we think about redlining, a lot of things with homeownership, especially, Black homeownership hit an all-time low. That was before COVID, in almost in 50 years, right? So that's so many of the problems. The COVID-19 crisis is shining light on all the cracks in the system that I think already existed, and I think most people here tonight already knew that housing is too expensive. People of color especially are shut out of the housing system in a lot of ways, both in finding affordable, safe rental housing. For decades, they've been shut out of the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. So there are more renters, and that it's all connected. So I was thinking about your question of what can the federal government do? Some of it is stopping the bleeding, right? There's the COVID-19 immediate bleeding, which is we need to keep people in their homes. As Tiana said, housing is the vaccine. And so we need every single person who has a safe home right now should be guaranteed to be able to stay there, at least not just for the duration of the pandemic, but also for the time it takes to rebuild. There's not going to be this magic switch that this vaccine is suddenly widely disseminated and everyone is back to normal. We all know that that's not the case. And people need a safe place to live once they start going back to work or looking for a new job, if that's the case. And they need a safe place for their families, and they need to know that that's taken care of before they can rebuild in any other area of their life. And so I think the federal government needs to step in to make that possible. So that's both making sure that evictions and foreclosures don't happen now, and that that's covered for a long enough period, but also kicking the can down the road with a year or 2 years worth of rent being due, that doesn't help anyone. That's going to mean that the tsunami of evictions, we're just going to push it down for a couple of years. That's not going to help anyone. The housing system being totally turned upside down in that way, it hurts all the individual families and the tenants and homeowners, but also the ramifications of that on the housing market at large is just terrible. Like that can't be the answer. And so that means making sure that there's enough resources put into the system to make sure that that housing can remain stable. And that means putting in a lot of money towards rental assistance and towards homeowner assistance funds. And as you mentioned earlier, Ellen, utilities, to make sure that utilities stay on, right? Because you can have a home that's safe, but if your lights aren't on, that's a whole, or your heating's not working, that's a whole different problem too. So we need to make sure that everyone right now who has a home, that home is going to be functioning for them and stable, really for after the pandemic as well, but just to focus first on COVID-19. We also need to make sure that if there's problems with those homes, if whether that's from landlords or from conditions issues, that there's ways to repair those things and there's ways to address those things. And there's also we're talking about communities of color. We also need to make sure that the tools to fight discrimination are in place. And that means both making sure that the tools that have existed for years remain. That's including things like the Fair Housing Act and affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was had been recently gutted. But there's a part of the Fair Housing Act that says we're supposed to actively work to reduce segregation and there's studies that show everyone benefits from more inclusive communities, and the quality of communities goes up as a whole, and that both the safety and all of those aspects, but also the benefits we have from learning from one another. Our Congress built that into the Fair Housing Act. That needs to come back and be strong again. People need to be able to fight against discrimination whether that's pricing or that's not being able to access certain types of housing. We need to make sure that if that happens, that there are ways, which we know it does, unfortunately it does, we need to make sure that people have a way to be able to fight against that and to prove their case. And right now, a lot of the policies that have been put into place over the last few years have made it really hard to fight against discrimination. It's gone the other way, and we need to make sure that those tools remain in place so people can defend themselves and take action in that way. So there's lots of those things. And then there's also just making sure that people have the resources, that there's homelessness services, and that people who are on the streets, as many of those people are getting housed in every way we can. I think we all knew that housing was important before this pandemic, but right now it's so important. It's more important than it ever has been. And so we need to make sure that we're taking care of our fellow person by making sure that they have access to housing. And I think our government can do a lot of things there. And also just going after bad behavior. I think there's like the things that the government can do proactively by passing legislation, a lot of things that Tiana's touched on already, stopping evictions and foreclosures, making sure that there's funding available for these services. But there's also just the implementation aspect, and that's where oversight comes in. That's where agencies come in to practically make some of this stuff possible, and also to send a message to bad actors that this is not, you can't prey on people right now. I mean, you can't prey on people at all, but especially right now, and to really send a message as far as the enforcement and that sort of stuff is concerned, that there's steps being taken to make sure that people are protected and that justice is served.
Thanks, Linda. I want to dig in for a second on one piece that you talked about, this idea that people need to have avenues, people need to have options to fight against housing discrimination. I know the AFR did some work around a rule coming out of Housing and Urban Development earlier this year on disparate impact that really limited the opportunities to challenge housing policies that perpetuate systemic racism by excluding people of color and other groups. Can you talk a little more about that ruling and how it affects people during this crisis, and what other things that the federal government could be doing to support the millions of people facing eviction right now?
Sure. Thanks for asking, Ellen. Disparate impact is something near and dear to my heart. Before I came to AFR, actually, I did some litigation and fair housing work here. And the important thing about disparate impact, just so people who aren't lawyers who don't follow those types of terms know what it is, it's a lot of times people who discriminate it's the smoking gun that we see where, I don't like you because you're a Black person, or I don't like your family because you have 2 little kids. Sometimes it's not blatant, unfortunately, even now, but more often than not, it's not. It's these seemingly neutral policies, but we know that racism and discrimination is built into those types of things. Often we see this in the credit reporting system that often reiterates the racial disparities in our society, for example. And so disparate impact is a tool that allows people to fight against discrimination if this neutral policy is in fact something that is hurting a certain category of protected people. So I'm just going to use, in this Black Lives Matter moment. So let's just say that for some reason under this policy for loans, all the Black people got more expensive loans. That's, some people did all the work on that. And so disparate impact is the tool that a group of people can fight back, saying that's not okay, that's illegal, that we've been discriminated against. Now, the disparate impact rule that was finalized this summer from the Housing and Urban Development it makes it a lot harder at the front end to bring that case. So you can imagine, even the way I just described this, it's pretty hard to get all the facts in order. We're not the company, right? We're the people, we're not the company. We don't have access to their documents. You have to do a lot of digging, a lot of statistical analysis to even build your case at the front end because you're not going to get any information from them unless you get your case going. Some of the problems with the rule and how they've made it so much harder is they've added a bunch of things on the front end to get over the hurdle of even bringing a case. It's just that much harder, and I would go into the technical details, but I think that will take too long. But a few of the other problems is if a company's policy has these discriminatory effects, but it's profitable, it puts the onus on the person bringing the case to say, you can't, like, this policy isn't great as far as the results are concerned, but this is the way we make the most money, and that the way the rule is written, it seems like that would be okay, which is a huge problem, right? It's not even that if there's a way that they could still be profitable but not make as much money, it's very there's lots of things there that insinuate that if a policy is profitable for a country, even if it's discriminatory, that could potentially be okay. There's some stuff about algorithms in there that are concerning that unfortunately, we've seen a lot of studies have come out in the last few years that the algorithms and the machine did it, the machine's neutral. And there's concerns about how that could be applied here and to get out of the fault for discrimination. It's not quite as the same as the proposal, but there's still problems with algorithms there. So those are some of the ways that the finalized rule is really problematic and make it even harder to fight discrimination. I think this is the worst moment in our history to roll back, to really gut one of the main ways people fight against discrimination and discriminatory policies. So I think it's something that we all need to keep an eye on. We all need to fight back on. And I know that there's lots of experts looking into the details on how to fight back about it. But out of the series of policies that we've seen, I think this one is really particularly painful to see how they're gutting this very important tool.
Now, is this disparate impact standard? Is this something that if we have a different head of HUD, that they can implement changes there, or is it something that we as people can push for and make a case for? What's the recourse here? Is my question. Where do we go from here?
Sure. So the rule has been finalized. So as far as HUD is concerned, it's final. I think there's a lot of, I know there's experts that are looking at how to respond to it legally. I think as people, if the leadership at HUD changes, agencies can propose new rules that are different from the ones that exist, right? This rule there was an earlier disparate impact rule that this rule superseded, right? And so a new head of HUD could also propose a new rule, a better one, one that restores the ability of people to fight against discrimination. And so that's a change in leadership or a change in direction could very much accomplish that. I think there are moments where HUD, I mean, there's not as many as there are with Congress, but there are moments where, you know, HUD, there's nothing that stops people from contacting HUD, right? So there's that element of it, but also I think who are leader, I think telling your Congress people, telling your elected officials that this is a problem, you know, they can put pressure on the regulatory agency too. So there's ways to pursue it that way. I think there's lots of folks who are, this rule is finalized very recently, so I think there's lots of folks who are trying to figure out the best ways to mobilize, but I think there will be opportunities to speak out against it. I think there's always publicity too, you know, whether that's through social media or through drawing, you know, writing op-eds or, you know, weighing in on that. You know, the voice of the people is always important, and it's always a matter of figuring out which best ways to plug in. And I know that is an ever-changing target as rules move through their different processes, and we are in different places of a cycle with things. But I think there will be more ways to respond.
Excellent. Thanks. That really helps clear things up there. One other quick question for you, hopefully a quick question. Regarding coalitional work, coalitional efforts, are there any other big efforts that you and your partner organizations are engaged in right now related to housing security that you want to share with everyone here today?
I mean, I think our office is, I mean, as far as our housing work is concerned, I mean, there's a lot that we focus on homeownership, given that we were a coalition formed to get Dodd-Frank passed and to continue to look at lending issues and especially lending discrimination issues, because that spans so many issues, types of loans and types of financial products. We see so many abusive terms, and we see so much discrimination, unfortunately, that's still embedded in there. So that's stuff we're looking at actively. And then there's, you know, on the housing side, there's the obvious and so important, you know, making sure that everyone stays housed. There's also something that we've looked at a lot is private equity and corporate landlords and them taking over. So trying to stop that, you know, trying to draw attention to that. Trying to, you know, work with folks to get strong protections for tenants in those situations as much as possible. Trying to make sure that housing, that if a landlord can't, a small landlord can't keep that one, you know, to try to find more ways to keep that housing in the community, both with the tenant side and the owner side as much as possible. So there's lots of moving pieces to that, but stuff that we're very much looking into.
I'm really glad that you raised all those points. And I want to call special attention to the point you made about private equity, because yeah, there are a number of private equity actors that fly under the radar, but they have this really pernicious effect on the industries that they operate in, from the way in which private equity firms come in and buy shares in the housing properties, or go in and buy up parts of hospital groups. It really has a negative impact on those industries, and more importantly, on the workers that work at those jobs and on the people who receive those services. So thanks for raising that point. And I want to thank you for sharing everything that you just told us about the work that AFR is doing, and sharing a little bit of information about the disparate impact rule. Now I'm going to turn to Sean Frenstad from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Sean, at CEPR, you're the Senior Policy Fellow, and you focus on a range of issues, including inequality, poverty, social security and assistance programs, immigration, family policy, class, gender, race, and disability. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
I want to talk a bit about some of the work that you've done at CEPR on the housing crisis. Linda and Tiana both zoomed in on systemic racism and the housing needs of communities of color. At CEPR, you and a colleague just recently released a report on how the pandemic has exacerbated the housing crisis, especially for communities of color. Can you talk about the findings from that report and how that contributes to where we are right now?
Sure. And I just want to thank both Linda and Tiana, testimony today was really moving, and I just want to really honor the work that organizers and People Action, the work you've been doing. It's been really inspiring, and it's inspired me and others at CEPR. So we're really lucky to be here. So thanks, Ellen. I should also say first, this new report was mostly the work of Ishia Kai, an economist at CEPR. She had another commitment tonight, so you got me instead, but I just want to make sure she gets most of the credit for this recent research we've done. So what did we find? First, we found that the share of people living in households that rent has increased over the last couple of decades, while the share of people living in homeowner households with mortgages has declined. And you see this especially when you look at households that include children in particular. And you also see it really strikingly among Black households generally. So in fact, most Black people now, about 55%, live in rental households today. And when you compare that to white households, it's only about 1/4 of white people. So this really stark disparity. Now, there's a lot of great things about renting and a lot of good reasons to rent, but that's also clearly a story of wealth disparity and lost, I think, equity and other things happening over time. So so very concerning. Second, we found that over the same period, the share of renter households who were burdened by rent, so basically pay more than 30%, pay more than 50%, and even people paying more than that even, that's increased over that same time period. So not just more people renting, but more people renting and paying unaffordable rents. Third, when we looked at what we called housing insecurity, so this is basically being worried, to more than a small degree about not being able to make next month's rent, or not paying last month's rent, that has increased in a particularly sharp way, especially for Black and Hispanic households during this pandemic when you compare it to prior years. But surprisingly, you don't see that kind of rise among white households, white renters. So over the last several months, about 45% of both Black households and Hispanic households reported being worried about paying next month's rent, compared to only about 22% of white households. Asian American households fall somewhere in between those two things, with about 1 in 3 reporting housing insecurity. And they've seen an increase too, not as large as Hispanic and Black households, but there's a noticeable increase that isn't the case for white households, which isn't to underplay. There are many white households who are feeling insecure, working class, low income white household, but again, a very stark disparity in how they're feeling during this period. Housing insecurity has largely been driven during the pandemic period, at least, by kind of the additional rise in it has been driven by jobs and earnings insecurity, not surprisingly. So we found renters who lost jobs or earnings were about 2.7 times more likely to be housing insecure than their more job stable counterparts. And we know, of course, that the differences in job stability have their own kind of gender, racial, class kind of dynamics underneath. So certainly playing into that, the racial and gender differences. And then finally, Ishia, this was really interesting, and I don't think we've seen it. I haven't seen this kind of analysis. She looked at differences by both gender and race, so kind of looking at a more intersectional analysis and adjusting for income or other factors. So kind of trying to control for things like income and job holding, etc. And even doing that, you find that it's Black women who have the highest probability of rental insecurity, followed not much of a big difference between Black women and Black men, and then Hispanics, Asians are somewhat, again, kind of in the middle, both around the same, not as big a gender differences within those groups, and then relatively low probability for both white men and women. So if I'm remembering right, it's about the difference, say, between Black women and white women is something like 5 times difference in probability of housing insecurity. And then again, kind of in the middle in between that is Hispanic households. And so I think part of the story here again is, I think, just a lot of underlying factors, people feeling more insecure for reasons that go beyond just income and probably have like wealth and family, all sorts of things I think going on, and just the experience of, Tiana mentioned racial capitalism, I think today, and kind of, the precariousness that leaves so many people and disparities by race and ethnicity. So that's basically the findings in our report, which you can, I think, hopefully they send out the link and you can find it on our website.
Thanks, Sean. And those findings from Isha are really, really interesting. It brings to mind the idea that several folks have been floating lately of Black women best. This idea that we need to start addressing the issues that impact Black women, and that's going to have an effect throughout the economy. And that needs to be the place where we start, and that needs to be the place where we're centering a lot of these conversations.
Yep.
And basically, I just did give our friend Janelle a little shout out there. So
yeah, former CEPR employee.
I have one other follow-up question about the study itself. What was the period of time that was covered?
So most of this study, we have the original study came out in August. So we were mostly looking at that initial, this was really when, so remember, you still had the $600 unemployment bonus. You still had other kind of protections in place. So if anything, I think it's understating the feelings of insecurity. And then there's also some newer, more up-to-date data on kind of basically through September. We haven't done as much of a kind of a looking at racial gender lenses on that, but you certainly see, this insecurity remains, it's heightened, and we want to, as you'd expect, and despite things like this CDC moratorium. And again, I think, so much of this, I think, gets back to the fact that, the rent's still accumulating. People have every reason to be worried about next month and what the future holds, especially if you don't have savings and you don't know, where your next job might be.
Thanks. So as we stated, the crisis has affected millions of Americans in so many ways, from the rising number of COVID-19 cases and deaths to the rise in the unemployment rate, while relief measures are now expiring, and that includes the eviction moratoriums. Where, again, rent is going to be due on the 1st, and that's just a couple of days away. A number of the provisions that we've kind of talked about a little bit that gave this relief to people impacted by the pandemic have recently or will soon expire. Millions of people can't afford their rent and are facing evictions. Can you tell us a little bit about how policymakers have been trying to address this, ways in which they've been trying to address some of the data that you pulled back the curtain on in the report?
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is we really can't underestimate how important the expansion of unemployment insurance. So to many people who were previously ineligible for UI because they had gig jobs or self-employment, as well as that $600 supplement to UI benefits. Both of those were in the CARE Act that passed this year. Unfortunately, that $600 supplement is now expired at the end of July. So far, the Senate has not passed the House Democratic, provisions that would much more effectively address the current crisis. We've got this temporary provision, which it's something, but I think, as Tiana mentioned, it's not a cure-all in any manner. And I think folks like Tiana know much better than I about what's really happening in cities across the country. I think, and again, a big issue is this failure to provide necessary rental housing assistance so that people can pay the rent, so that they don't have these debts accruing. There are landlords out. Not all landlords are big, horrible corporations. There are some that really depend on this, and their financial security is an issue too. So I think it you need something that's a more comprehensive solution, obviously, than what we have in place. Otherwise, we're just going to see this massive wave of eviction once the CDC moratorium. And I imagine even despite that, we're seeing some of that happening now. So I would also say beyond the COVID specific legislation that, hopefully we'll get, some movement on that in the next week or so. The People's Housing Platform, which is a set of bills introduced in the House earlier this year by members of the Progressive Caucus, is really pointing toward the long-term solution, the kind of lasting solution that we need. So massive investments in permanently affordable housing, making sure that we stop this rationing of public housing rental assistance. So if you're eligible, you get the help that, just like you're eligible for a big tax cut, we don't ration those. We shouldn't be rationing housing assistance to people who are eligible. Does things like combating gentrification, exclusionary zoning, segregation, strengthening tenants' rights. I just think all those things. And in many ways, despite how bad things have been this pandemic, it's been a good year for big vision on housing policy. And we have, a great, not as far as I'd like to see, but a good platform that presidential candidate Biden is running on housing, certainly better than anything I've seen in my lifetime. And, we've also got a kind of sharp contrast in terms of an administration that has really done some really horrible things, regulatory things in particular, on housing, discriminating, both the disparate impact issue that came up, but also discriminating against LGBTQ trans people, against immigrants. So it's just, we have whatever happens in this election, I think it's an important choice, and it's hopefully going to continue to be an issue in Congress next year.
Excellent. Thanks, Sean. Thanks. So we got a little bit of time left, and like you mentioned, there is an election coming up, and there's a debate around that coming up a little later tonight. So I think we want to go to a couple of questions from the audience, from the live stream. And I'll pose these out to everyone. And please feel free, panelists, to weigh in if it's something that you feel particularly moved to speak to. The first question I'm going to ask, and this may be, since you've dealt with this a bit, Tiana, maybe you can weigh in on this, but we of course want to hear from everyone. This question reads, there's supposed to be a moratorium in my state, but my landlord is still threatening to evict me. What options do I have?
All right. First of all, if you are in Kansas City, Missouri, definitely want to go to kctenants.org. We have an organizing toolkit that will help you from start to finish organize against the eviction or you're going to address your landlord. There's a letter there, a sample letter that you can send that our Heartland Center, who has been doing representation for tenants here, has put together. It's all legal. So first, if you're in Kansas City, you definitely want to go to kctenants.org. It's going to give you everything that you need. But I believe there are similar things put in place in quite a few states that we've looked at, which is where we kind of got some of the ideas. There are lots of states that are organizing for tenants to try to give them some protection. I know that we are connected to lots of them across the U.S. So it sometimes takes some digging, but there is something there. If you have any tenants' rights organizations in your city, reach out to them. Most of them do have something in place. If not, they will definitely meet you where you're at. That's where we get a lot of our people from our base. They call in, something has happened, and we kind of organize around them, and they want to get involved. So reach out to them. They are always there to help. We all reach out to each other as organizations, especially if we know each other, so that we can lean on each other for those ideas. And usually we share them. So.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, I'm a former legal services attorney, so I will say what Tiana just said, contact your tenants' rights organizations in your area, contact your legal aid in your area. I know a lot of those are getting overwhelmed at the moment, unfortunately, but try to get through to them. Some of them have, I know they used to have clinics. Right now, those might be through Zoom or something, but look into those numbers. Also look into, do you have a local or state moratorium in place, and is that coming to an end? I know this is a tricky time, especially for tenants, because a lot of the courthouses are now open again, which means tenant court is often open again as far as the court business is concerned, which makes it really tricky. So I guess also check, is there something in your state or local area, or are you relying just on the CDC? The CDC order is important, but there is that affidavit that you have to sign that, and if you're confused about that, talk to your tenants' rights organization or your local attorneys who are going to be better versed than your landlord tenant law is also really local. CDC thing is trying to be sweeping. Also why I think Congress needs to act, because they have the tools to have a much more comprehensive and stronger solution. There's a lot of implementation questions I think that are coming up. The other thing is where you are, like, is your landlord just threatening to evict you? Have they taken you to court? Like, where that is all going to matter. But folks in your local area are going to be better equipped to help you than we are in these 2 minutes. But there should be resources in your area, at least, and I hope there's a tenants' rights organization wherever you are, and there should be a legal aid office. Hopefully you can get in touch with them, but seek out those local resources. Hopefully they'll be able to guide you based on what's going on where you are. And of course, stay strong. Like, that sounds cheesy, but I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Like, keep up the good fight. You can see from Tiana, right? Keep up the good fight.
Absolutely. Thanks. For the next question, as we kind of mentioned, there was a new relief package that was just released in the House of Representatives last night. It's in the early stages, but we do know that it does offer some additional relief. There's $50 billion in emergency rental assistance, $21 billion in emergency homeowners assistance. What do folks here think about the housing related provisions in that legislation? And what do you think we could improve on? And what do you think they're pretty much doing what needs to be done now?
I guess I could speak from a tenant's point of view. As always unusual, it seems to me that it came a little, too little, too late. People have been hurt for a long time now, and then they come on the back end with the proposal, and that's the scary part. And then what's going to get picked apart before we do get something passed from someone who is truly in crisis, like there are so many of us that are right now. We needed something yesterday, and we have no idea how this process is going to go, and it's still terrifying.
Thanks, Tiana.
Yeah.
And you make a very good point. We did need this yesterday. The House tried to pass something back in May to offer assistance, and the Senate decided not to act upon it. And to their shame, although they don't have much, I don't know if I can say that. This is a C3 conversation, but yeah, thank you for raising that important point. I interrupted you, Sean. I think you were about to jump in.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's great to see the House Democrats continue to push. There's always room for improvement, but at this point, this is we need to do something, and we'll need to do more after the election too, obviously. But but right now we really need to do something, and I think the marker that the House has laid down is very good.
Yeah, there's a number of things in there that are really necessary, and they were necessary, as Tiana said, they were necessary a long time ago, right? As far as when this whole pandemic started, but I do think that the House has done their best to fill in where more things were needed than the first round of the HEROES Act, and so I think they've really tried to build on it. Some things from the CARES Act expired, in the time the HEROES Act was introduced the first time to now. And so I think they're trying to lay down this marker about things that really do as a practical matter need to get done. They needed to get done yesterday, they still need to really get done. And so unfortunately, we don't know if there's any hope of it actually moving forward as a practical matter. And that's the big concern.
Yep. Well, thanks for that, everybody. Since we are getting close to 8 o'clock hour, I think it'd be great if we could kind of tie the knot on this by turning to each of you to ask, what do you think we should do next to really make some meaningful progress towards more housing security for people all over the country in this crisis and after this crisis?
I think that, like Linda said, that there is much fighting that needs to be done at the local levels. KC Tenants is going to do a campaign at a local level that we think is our next step in, fighting the housing injustice that we see here. We were looking at things broader, of course, with this pandemic and things going on. But I think that you do more work at the local level and have more of an effect. And so we are kind of stepping back into local so that we can make some change, as much immediate change as we can right here in the city. So I think that that's a big thing for everyone. Like Linda said, connect locally and then grow out, right? Move at the speed of trust and build out so that, once you get those numbers and you grow out, that you are all on the same page and you've made those connections, like I said, so that when you're standing out there, it's not just you standing there for you. You have this mutual interest and you're standing there with the person next to you and so on. And so that fight and that connection and people's solidarity becomes stronger. So keep fighting at your local level and build at the speed of trust.
That's great, Tiana. That's great. Sean or Linda?
I don't think I can put it any better than that. But yeah, local, state, federal. I think it's really essential just to make sure that housing is a top priority right now, but next year, and that keep up the visibility. I think it's really been great to see housing become more of a top flight national issue. I just think we need to make sure it really happens.
Thanks, Sean. And Linda?
I'll just tie together what Sean and Tiana said and say your elected officials, I mean that from your local city council all the way to your senator and your congressman here in DC or congresswoman, they should be hearing from you because they represent you. Whoever you are, your constituent, tell them what's going on with your housing problems. Like they should be hearing from you. Educate those people around you about what's going on with the policies as you learn about them. And then as Tiana said, band together with your fellow people in your neighborhood and in your communities and really, because one voice versus the voice of an entire community, that's amplify those voices and keep up the good fight. And so I think just putting all of that together, put the pressure locally and put the pressure here in Washington. They should be hearing from you about what we really need right now. Is the companies, they're gonna call up their electors all the time. There's nothing. We're all equal constituents here. We need to all just keep pushing. I think that's keep pushing together. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's perfect. That's perfect. If I had to take everything that the three of you said right now, I think it boils down beautifully to keep fighting, keep pushing, and organize. And that seems to be the path forward here for all of us. So we are right at 8 o'clock, and that's pretty much our time for tonight. I want to once again thank all of our guests, Tiana Caldwell, co-founder of KC Tenants and a leader on the People's Action Home Guarantee team, Linda June, Senior Policy Counsel at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, Sean Frimstad, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and of course, People's Action. I'd also like to thank my fabulous colleagues at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center Parker Breza, Jessica Juarez Scruggs, and Laura, who did a lot of organizing of this event on the back end, as well as the awesome We Act TV team that made a lot of this possible. And I'd also like to thank each of you watching this and every single person who's taken action to demand safe and affordable housing for all. At the end of the day, policy alone doesn't make the change. It's the people who have the power to make the change. All of these discussions would be pointless without your support, passion, and fire. Thank you, and good night to everybody. Take care.